Well, just working okay, Denny, you can hear me? Yeah. Thanks, I very much appreciate the opportunity. I noticed he used the past tense when he referred to me as a swine nutritionist, and I guess that really is true, although I still get up in the morning and look in the mirror and see a guy that raises hogs. But the opportunity to be here is that I was reminded last night, this is my third trip, and you've never asked me to talk about nutrition. It's always something else, so maybe that says something about anything that I did accomplish. My topic this morning is academic and industry partnerships, and I'll probably say some things that'll upset some people. I'll probably say some things that really make others happy, and most of you probably won't care, so that's where we'll go this morning. I want to begin by introducing a word, and it's one that you probably all know, paradigms. Back when I used this once out at the swine farm, the manager said, well, that's 2 trips to the pay toilet. Most people in the room don't know what a pay toilet is, but you and I would. It's the old days. Paradigm is a way of doing something, and paradigms change. The way we go about doing things changes, and a paradigm shift is a fundamental change in how we approach some problems or the underlying assumptions. And when a paradigm changes, you kind of have to start over. It means that the way you used to do it no longer is serving you well. So I'll give an example. When I went off to college, my parents gave me a Kodak Instamatic camera in the 1960s. It was the latest and greatest. You no longer had to roll film into the camera. You used a little cassette, you just dropped it in, took your pictures and sent it off, and 2 weeks later they came back or something like that. Well, today, I don't think anybody uses a camera like that except me and a few old people my age. But Kodak missed the paradigm shift. And in January 2012, Kodak declared bankruptcy. And so paradigm shifts, paradigm changes can have dire consequences. They can have very good consequences if you anticipate them and prepare yourself to deal with them. One of the great paradigm changes that took place in this country more than 100 years ago was the creation of the land-grant university system. It came about in 1862 through an act of Congress, the Morrill Act. Prior to that, education, higher education, was pretty restricted. It was private, and it was relatively restricted in terms of curriculum and what one would study, certainly not agriculture. And the land-grant universities were created because there was a need. The U.S. as a population was beginning to grow. There were areas like Indiana that were beginning to be populated and settled. The nation was beginning to industrialize. And if you're going to have industry in places like Indianapolis and Chicago and Pittsburgh, you had to have an efficient system for feeding people. So the needs of the country were, you needed engineers to do the engineering for the industry, and you needed people doing agricultural teaching and research to improve the efficiency of the agricultural system. And oh, by the way, we're in the midst of the American Civil War, so you needed military leaders, so reserve officer training got added to the land-grant mission. Agriculture in 1862, and perhaps for 100 years after that, was a major national priority. If there wasn't good agriculture, there was problems with food. And the Land-Grant Act, the Morrill Act, created the universities, and then in 1887, I've got this date wrong, the Congress passed a second act creating agricultural experiment stations. So there'd be some new knowledge created that could be taught in the classroom about agriculture. Every state was required to establish one. They were given funding through formula to the states. That still goes on today, although is not nearly as much as we'd like for it to be. And they were designed to do research relevant to the needs of a state. And just about every state in the country needed swine research to improve the efficiency of swine production. So the ag experiment stations in that era had a significant involvement in typically agricultural research directed at improving the efficiency with which we produced pigs. That was actually the first federal bonding. That lasted for about 100 years, and then the Second World War happened, and that's the bomb nuclear blast, as you could probably recognize. And I'm not here to celebrate that, but I'm here to just point out that universities during the Second World War massively collaborated in the research discoveries that were needed in that to resolve that conflict and bring it to what was viewed as a successful end. And so the nation woke up and realized that in these universities, particularly the land grants, we have this incredible research capacity. How do we use it to meet national needs? Truman was the president. He asked a leader that had come from MIT in the war effort to do a study of how the nation should utilize its research capacity in universities. The guy's name was Bush, and what he said in that report set the course for university research for the next half century or more, and that's important to this conversation. He said, new products and new processes do not appear full grown. They're founded on new principles and new concepts, which in turn are painstakingly developed into realms of science, pure science. He recommended that universities will be the primary national research infrastructure, and we were worried about the Cold War, the Soviet threat. And in short, universities were to do fundamental research, basic research to discover new phenomena, and the private sector would take that new knowledge and carry it into application. And if you think about that, it has served agriculture incredibly well. If you think about the biotech revolution that's occurred in plant science and some that's being done in animal science, the fundamental discoveries around gene mapping, gene research were done at universities, and then it was the private sector that carried these on into products. You think about what's happening in computer technologies that have changed the scope, the face of agriculture, and drastically today, continuing to do that. The research came out of fundamental discoveries around the physics of electron transfer and the physics that led to the creation of transistors, etc., and information technology devices. That then was taken by companies like Microsoft and Infosys in India or Apple and turned into technologies that we use today. So it wasn't wrong. It was a great idea. The National Science Foundation was created to fund that kind of research. The priorities for the National Science Foundation were established by a National Science Board. The impacts between 1950, when all this was happening, and about 1990 were that universities were increasingly driven by national priorities, particularly national defense priorities in the 50s and 60s. Less attention began to be given to agriculture research. We had enough food, no word to worry about that. And in particular, the kind of translational research that applies discoveries to application at the university level. Ag colleges, of course, were involved in fundamental discovery research, but they also continued to give major emphasis to translational research, the kind of applied research that I did in my career, Jim Pettigrew, Gary Cromwell, Tyler Tipkine, others that are senior wearing the gray hair here today. We were significantly funded by formula funds that were appropriated by the Congress to do that kind of research. In a minute, I'll show you some numbers. They haven't increased over the years very much, so that funding is increasingly at risk. Then in the 1960s and 70s, we got a focus on health. National Institutes of Health was massively increased in its funding. In the 1980s, there was the view that the Japanese were going to destroy our economy because they were doing a lot of innovation. And the Congress passed a whole series of laws that obligated universities receiving federal funding to take that into commercialization by patenting the technology and then licensing it to some company. The NSF, the creation of the NIH's major funding streams, these acts in the 1980s really impacted universities and what they do, and in a sense, the preeminence of agricultural colleges within universities. You know, I've had a chance to look at this from every direction, as a faculty member, as a department head, as a dean of agriculture, as an interim provost deciding which college gets the money, and then as a president dealing with the legislators who determine what kind of appropriations are going to happen. So I have a sense of the real impact that these kinds of things have had upon us. We had an incredible golden era until about 1990, and from 1920 to 90, and I would frame it that budgets were good. There was a very close alignment between agricultural research and universities and application of that research in the disciplines of production agriculture. I used to regularly come over to Purdue for the Purdue Swine Day, as many others did, and then Purdue faculty would come to the Illinois Swine Day. And we would present the latest and greatest from our laboratories, and farmers would take it home and put an application the next day. It was a very direct pipeline. Things have changed. The kinds of the kinds of research that are done today in the university laboratories need to be translated often by some other entity into a product or technology. It's just a change in the paradigm, the way things are done. Extension was well funded. Extension staff identified with the needs of the rural communities, and it was a good era. And there were an abundance of students with an agricultural background and interest, and there were faculty within colleges of agriculture who had that same background and understood the needs of agriculture. I would argue about 1990, things began to change. University research increasingly became more basic, and with that, technology and information was increasingly delivered by other players. I used to say in Illinois, when it got to the farm, it was no longer orange and blue. For the first 15 or 20 years I was on the faculty, the farmer knew where his new variety of soybeans came from, he knew where his new wheat variety came from, he knew where the recommendations for formulating his swine diet came from. Things changed as the university changed its priorities and the delivery system began to change. But there's also a shift. Obviously our population was becoming more more urban. There was not a natural constituency supporting farm programs. Lowell Randall's here in the room and he could probably correct me. I think there are about 25 members of Congress now, the 525, who actually represent districts where agriculture is the primary source of revenue. So there's a very minor part of the congressional delegation from across the country that actually has a constituency back home saying you've got to support agricultural research. Of course, there are others who recognize the importance, and I'm not trying to diminish that. Well, traditional platforms for information begin to change. I grew up in a world where I was expected to produce pamphlets for the extension people, to work with them to produce them. I don't know anybody that goes to the local extension office today and gets a pamphlet unless they're my age or older. It's all delivered online. And I was speaking to an extension audience last week and I said, you know, I used to go to your extension website and put in a word like, I'm dealing with, I have peach trees. My peach trees had brown rot this year. So I put in brown rot. I didn't even go to the extension website. I went to Google and I Googled it. And there were 5 on the first page extension publications that came up, but I didn't even have to go to, and they were, one was from Penn State and another one's Wisconsin, one from Illinois, thankfully. You don't even go to the extension website to access that information. Paradigms change. And rural population decline. There are fewer farm kids in the classroom, and it's increasingly difficult to recruit faculty who have the kind of backgrounds that most of us of my generation came into an ag college with. Nothing wrong with that. It's just a reality. Paradigms change. And colleges of agriculture begin to change as well. So I want to start shifting now in what I'm talking about. I've given enough of a history lesson, I suppose. Deans and department heads have to make a lot of decisions. They make technical decisions, they make personnel decisions, but all of these are underscored in some sense by business decisions. How do you make the place function financially? When I was a dean, I had a department head that got in difficulty. He spent more money than he had. He lost his job. You realize that you can't do that. You have to stay within your budget. And today what department heads look at is they're deciding whether to fill a swine nutrition position that's been vacated by retirement by another swine nutritionist who does what was traditionally there, or by somebody who can do something else. Maybe they teach a companion animal course and they could draw 100 students a semester. That's a lot of tuition revenue, but there's not much research funding there. So they have to do research in an area that maybe uses the dog as a model to study an issue that's important to the National Institutes of Health. You can get a $300,000 grant from NIH. NIH grants carry, at our place, 56% indirect cost overhead. So as a dean or a department head, I'm thinking, if I fill that position with a faculty member who can fill the classroom, that's a lot of tuition revenue to keep my budget solid. If that individual has the science skills that can get a major grant from National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and bring in a very large chunk of overhead cost. I can pay the power bill, the water bill, and all the bills maintaining the building and so forth. It varies a bit state by state, university by university, how those things get worked out, but the underlying case is, how do we keep the place functional? You also look at what's it going to cost to operate the facility. Today, you hire a new faculty member in the sciences, you may be looking at $1 million setup just to get their lab going. If you hire a faculty member that has to have a big swine farm, there's a real cost associated with that too. So you're kind of weighing in your head, what are the overhead costs of sustaining that research program? And ultimately, you get to what you really want to do and say, well, what does the state's agriculture need? But it has to work financially before you could actually make those decisions. I don't think, this thing, Denny, I've run out of gas here. There we go. So, you know Sutton's Law. Willie Sutton was this, repeatedly from Indiana, I think, or Ohio, this guy that robbed banks. And somebody once asked him, well, why do you rob banks? He said, well, that's where the money is. So I guess what I've talked about is department heads, oops, maybe we can, yeah, maybe I could do it from somewhere else, who make decisions about keeping a college financially viable. They do it through state funding, they worry about tuition, and they worry about overhead cost and recovery of those overheads. Let's talk about where the federal government, which is the primary source of support for research. Research is the primary vehicle for training the next generation of graduate students. Just see if it works here. Yeah. Well, now I've got to get back to what I wanted to talk about. There we go. Health and Human Services, more than half of the money that's put into university research comes from the National Institutes of Health. A lot of it goes to medical schools. National Foundation Science Foundation, 13%, DOD 12%. Agriculture is at 2.6% and not going in the right direction. So if you think about what deans of agriculture have, if they have primarily faculty going to USDA for research support that results in training graduate students, they are looking at a pretty small pie to deal with, about $1 billion a year. If you divide that across all of the institutions in the US, it's a pretty slim number. So what successful faculty members have been doing for a long time in swine nutrition is going to the private sector and saying, let's work together. So what we're talking about here is not a new topic. It's simply a question about, do we need to do something more regular? Realities, ag is not a political priority, so getting particularly animal research. Do you have another one of these, Scott, any chance? Okay. Within agriculture, animal agriculture is not a priority. You know, if you look at where USDA today is investing its money, it's in areas not necessarily in animal agriculture. Okay, and the reality is also our historic approach has been kind of peanut butter, spreading peanut butter. We give everybody a little bit, USDA gives everybody a little bit of money, all the states get some, but none enough to really do what needs to be done. Next slide, please. Well, it's a paradigm change, and that's what I was talking about. Next. University, the paradigm change is taking place. University capacity and access to funding for applied research is declining significantly. It's a long-term trend. Next, please. The swine industry today is incredibly different from the one that I came into in 1976. I taught pork production the first time in 1976, had over 100 students in the class. We had over 100 students every semester, and most of them came from swine backgrounds. They were going back to raise hogs. There were about 35,000 pork producers in the state of Illinois. Today, I still give some lectures in that class. We had a good year last year. We had 20. Usually it's about 12 to 15. Most of them aren't really that interested, but they thought it might be an interesting elective to take. The National Swine Center did a survey a few years ago. There was about 25 places around the country that were actually teaching a pork production course. Enrolled nationally was fewer than 500. So the challenge for departments is sustaining capacity to do that. Well, that brings us to today. Here we are, September 7th, 2017, and what does the future look like? Next one. The challenge. How do we do the non-proprietary research? Industry is going to do the proprietary research. Either it's an input supplier, whether it's a pork production integrator or large industry, will do the research that's important to the success of their business, whether it's a product delivery or whether it's something related to their individual operations. They will do that. I was actually visiting one of the large operations in Illinois a couple of days, last Friday actually, overwhelmed by their capacity to do very applied research, but things really relevant directly to what they were doing. But how do we do the research? Where's the research going to be done that prepares the next generation of technical professionals and scientists who are going to work for those companies as well as populate universities? Universities aren't going away, and the world isn't coming to an end, but the paradigm is changing. And I think the question is it time for greater public-private cooperation? And I leave that to you to think about that and perhaps think about how that might be done. I want to talk about 4 examples around the world about where there's a different paradigm, a different model in place for the doing of applied swine nutrition and other research. And probably the one that's most familiar to us here in the U.S. is the Prairie Swine Center. John Patience, who's now at Iowa State, headed that for many years. It actually began initially as an effort by University of Saskatchewan. It was part of their entity, and a few years after that, they decided to broaden the conversation and bring others into it. It was established to focus in some key areas. Nutrition, it's always had a major focus. This is directly off their website. In animal behavior ethology, and also in engineering, building design, building operations, and so forth. It provides research to its membership. It also, in public, it's a public entity, and it also provides educational programs to industry. We would call it a not-for-profit enterprise here. It's incorporated as, I don't know what they call them in Canada, as a not-for-profit. And it supports graduate student training, which I think is critical, not just for University of Saskatchewan, but most of the ag colleges across Canada. Their mission statement: we're a source of innovation, providing solutions through knowledge, helping to build a profitable and sustainable pork industry. And they have focused in their research program on near market emphasis, information needed directly by the industry to make management decisions, feeding decisions, etc., to maximize income. Core funding comes from programs, agencies in the government. It also comes from a number of private sector organizations and contracts that they do with business. It's interesting, and as I've looked at each of these, I've looked at their board of how are they governed, who's in charge, who makes the decisions about what areas they will emphasize. And they have a very small board of trustees that operate the Prairie Swine Center. Mary Burr is the dean at the College of Agriculture, University of Saskatchewan. She chairs the board. They have an individual who's a long-term board member who's associated with their pork industry organization, the Saskatchewan Pork Development Board. James Reeser operates what we would view in this country as a very large integrated swine operation. Some of you may know him. Wayne Thompson represents the grain industry. The grain industry in that part of the world recognized that a major market for them has always been the livestock sector. So they have a presence, and it provides support to this entity in order to support ultimately their marketing. Small board. It's interesting to look at others around the world. Pork CRC, and this was kind of a learning exercise for me. I knew Roger Campbell had gone back to Australia to do this a number of years ago. Cooperative Research Center. The Australian government has taken a bit of a different approach to how it manages kind of industry sector research and education. They have a whole series of these CRCs, and the CRCs focus in this case on the pork industry. There's one related to beef, there's other related to other sectors of agriculture and other sectors of actually industry. This has been around for 12 years. It was established through the Commonwealth Ministry of Industry and Science, which means that there's money that comes into it directly from government. But the task of deciding how those resources get used is assigned to that entity, not to their department, the Ministry of Agriculture, etc. Their mission, and it's interesting to think about the words they use, to differentiate Australian pork as a high-integrity meat. I'm not sure how meat has integrity. I guess it's safe. High quality is welfare, optimal, premium quality, nutritious and high demand nationally and internationally, in which is produced while conserving energy and water, minimizing greenhouse gas emissions, maintaining efficiency and cost of production at levels which encourage investment and growth and sustainability. I think what that says is we're going to work with the pork industry and we're going to make it successful. And just about everything falls within that umbrella. Their board has mostly non-government individuals serving on it. You can look at their titles. It's also done with the government in New Zealand, so there's a New Zealand pork producer who's a member. And some of you will recognize there's an academic, John Plusky, who a number of you would know in the room. But they're organized around topics that are important. There's a finance person that kind of leads their conversations around things that they do in economics of pork production. There's an ag scientist, there's a lawyer, and you can see that the kind of board, it's not a university committee sitting down and deciding what's going to be done. It's a board that broadly represents and understands the needs of that industry. I think it's an interesting model. They get a lot of money in some sense. I don't quite know how this, Jim Pettigrew probably knows how this translates into US dollars, directly from the government. They have private sector support. They don't do research. Unlike the next entity that I want to talk about, they don't have a research enterprise. They do grant funding. They assign it to, sometimes it's a private sector entity that does it, sometimes it's a consultant, and there are times when it's done by a university, just depending on where it's best. They have educational programs. They work with the industry on placement and so forth. Just listed some of their titles. All of these have annual reports. They're on the web. You can look at them. Some of the things that they do, that I think has to do with flavor. Chemosensing is Roger's big word for flavor, I guess. Feed intake. Synchrony, I guess, relates to nutrient balance and delivering nutrients at the right place at the right time. But as you look down the list, these are topics that we would be interested in as a swine industry in the U.S. So they're doing the kinds of research that their industry has determined to be important to their success. I want to move now to Denmark, the Danish Pig Research Center, and I want to thank Hans for helping me, Hans Stein, for understand this, and even he doesn't know what SEGS stands for, but I'm sure it's something particularly important. But in English, their titles on all their documents are the Danish Pig Research Center. And, it's in charge of research and development tasks related to the live pig and of communicating knowledge obtained through those activities. Interestingly enough, I understand that there are 2 animal science departments in Denmark, and some of you probably know far better than I, none of which have a significant applied component to their research effort. The pork industry in Denmark is served by this enterprise to do that kind of work. Their areas of activity are pretty comprehensive. They do genetic research, obviously, with their line of Dan-bred pigs. It's a source of revenue for them. They do innovation across facilities, nutrition, operational management. They do marketing research, business research, and then the breeding program that they have. A lot of their work relates to welfare and environmental issues, which have a significant prominence in the European community. It gives them the opportunity to export into markets that might have these things as important considerations. It's probably to their annual report 2015. I haven't found their 2016 report. Lists their board members, and strikingly, they're all hog farmers. Every one of them is a pork producer. There's no government representative, there's no representative. Maybe it's somewhere else, but I didn't discern it. And it's probably too small to see, but they are elected from different sectors of the industry. So they have a comprehensive perspective when they sit down for a board meeting to work with their management team on issues that they will be addressing and setting priorities for the research program. They also, somewhat like MPPC in this country, they grapple with some of the political issues as well, which pork CRC and prairie swine center do not. They're very proud, and if you look at their annual report, and I apologize, this isn't a high quality slide, but They talk about the progress between 2004 and 2014. They've sow feed per pig weaned down by 9.4 kilograms. Weaned piglets per year, they show an increase of 6 per sow per year. That's a pretty remarkable increase. They do all the statistical data for the pork industry in Denmark. So if you look at their report every year, it has a real detailed summary, and they must have an incredible collection system for pulling all this kind of information together. But they another that I have, because of other connections or some knowledge of, is a CRIA that operates in Argentina, and it, in many respects, looks like what we used to have in this country before extension was created, where farmers come together to farm associations. They employ technical professionals to conduct on-farm research and give them advice based upon this. And obviously Argentina is primarily focused on grain crops, oilseeds, and beef cattle and dairy. So that's the areas of emphasis within CRIA. Regionally, they aggregate into a national organization called AACRIA, and provide information nationally. They have a great website. If you're literate in Spanish, you can spend a good hour or two looking at some of the work they're doing. They're more of an advisory system than a research system such as the Danes have. Well, I kind of bring this to a close by wrapping up, and much of this I've put in the written text, so if you're interested in looking at it, it's there. As we go forward, will there be an entity in the U.S. that assumes leadership for, in some way, managing the public-private relationship? Or will it continue to be the kind of one-off relationships that individual faculty members have with an industry in their area of interest? And I don't have a particular position on that. Either one can work. It's a matter of what comes out and works out to be best. If there is an entity in the U.S., I think it would have some characteristics. If there was an equivalent to the pork CRC, or if there was an equivalent to Swine Center, Prairie Swine Center, if there was something that was similar to the Danish, it would probably get the majority of funding from industry. And I grew up in an era where Washington and Springfield, Illinois, in my world, were the primary sources of dollars. And given our state's financial situation, and maybe my bias is formed by our state's financial situation in Illinois, but given the national government's challenges financially, the portion of the federal budget that is non-discretionary, if you look at the federal budget, and you probably think about this every night before you go to bed, a very large portion of the federal budget is determined already. Congress doesn't have the discretion of deciding every year how it's going to go. Social Security is a fixed cost. Medicare is a fixed cost. There's a whole bunch of fixed costs there. The discretionary part, where research funding sets, is a relatively small portion of the federal budget, and every year it gets smaller and smaller. Research funding is going to be increasing. I don't think there's any reason not to see that research funding from the national level is going to be increasingly tight. And it's not only affecting agriculture. We'll have to fight for our share of the pie. But others that have depended heavily on that will have to deal with that as well. There's been some intriguing articles, Wall Street Journal and other places the last few days, about the challenge of maintaining the quality of research universities that have made this country, I would argue, successful in a lot of domains. So I think that a majority of the funding in some way is going to come from industry. The Danes have, like we do, a check-off program, about $1 a pig. They also have other sources of EU funding and so forth. But I think that industry will have a significant role in providing funding. And as a result of that, the governance structure of whatever entity exists will be substantially representative of the funding funders. And that's just the reality of how things have to work. And I think it also is important that it keeps the focus on things that are important to success. And the focus won't be a lot of blue sky work. You know, it's really fun when you're an academic to have the luxury of just saying, what if? And you go try something really crazy. And sometimes something great comes out of it. Most of the time you spend money and nothing happens. it's going to be hard to find that kind of dollars in the future. It'll be focused more on problems that are immediate, that have to be addressed, something to deal with. And it will hopefully be done in close association with academic institutions. I probably, for a former university president, come across as negative on universities, and I certainly don't want to do that. There's incredible new science that will have impact 20, 30, 40 years ago now being done on university campuses. And the challenge is for industry to maintain the kinds of connections that will allow the industry to exploit those discoveries. And so I do believe that whatever we do, that there has to continue to be a close association between those academic discovery and some translational labs and application in the field. And back about 20 years ago, the U.S. Congress funded a national pork center that was built at Iowa State. It's now been relocated out of the University of Iowa State University down to, I think the Pork Board and MPPC have a role in it. I don't know what role it has, and I think that's a question that might be interesting to talk about someday. And that brings me to the end. I think I've saved enough time, Denny, for maybe a couple of questions here. Thank you.